Your anatomy is a blueprint. You are an architect. Beneath your skin lie the plans for your fastest, strongest, most powerful self. If you can learn the structure of your skeleton, the makeup of your muscle, and the mechanics of movement, you can create your best possible body.
I'm Mike Robertson. This is Built by Science. Men and women alike want to build an aesthetically appealing set of shoulders. Whether you call them cannonball delts, boulder shoulders, or mushroom caps, at the end of the day, if you want to build a great set of shoulders, you got to keep them injury-free and healthy as well. And in my field, one of the worst injuries that you can have is a shoulder injury because it's going to keep you from doing so many of your favorite lifts in the gym. In this episode, we're not only going to cover the muscular anatomy, the bones and the joints, the movements, and the key exercises that you're going to follow, but we're also going to show you guys some key things that are going to help keep your shoulders healthy and moving the way that you want for a lifetime. With us here today is WBFF Fitness Pro Jen Jewell. She's got a great looking physique, a great looking set of shoulders, and she's going to help both you and I better understand the anatomy and function of your shoulders. Let's go ahead and dive into the muscular anatomy of your shoulders. One of the best ways to understand this is to think of peeling an onion. On the outermost layer of your onion, you have what are called your deltoids. And these are the big shoulder muscles that most people are interested in building in the gym. So I'm going to use Jen here. And just to give you guys an idea, you've got 3 heads to your deltoids. You have an anterior head, a middle head, and a posterior head. So the anterior head runs from your clavicle or your collarbone, comes down and across and ends up on your humerus or your arm bone. So it starts at the top or front of your clavicle, comes down and across. The second is what's called your middle deltoid. So I'm going to have Jen just give me a little quarter turn here. And if you can imagine, this actually runs from the top of your scapula or your acromion process of your scapula, comes down, and it also attaches on the outer portion of your arm. Last but not least, you have what's called your posterior deltoid, and I'll show this on Jen's opposite side here. But if you can imagine on the back side of her scapula, it's her scapular spine, or that ridge on your shoulder blade, that's where your posterior delt starts. And it comes down and across, and it also ends up on your humerus or upper arm bone. Now that we've covered your deltoids, I want you to imagine having that onion, right? The deltoids are the outside portion of your onion. And if you peel away that top layer, underneath, you're left with a deep layer. And that's what's essentially called your rotator cuff, or your rotary cuff if you're from Indiana like I am. When you're talking about your rotator cuff, there's 4 muscles that I want you guys to envision. And it's going to be kind of hard to see on Jen because they are deep to your deltoids, but I'm going to point them out to you anyways. Your rotator cuff is comprised of your infraspinatus, right? And that's a big muscle that spans the outside portion of your scapula. Underneath your infraspinatus, you have a smaller muscle called your teres minor. The next muscle we're going to talk about is called your supraspinatus, and it runs from the top of your scapula, comes down, and it attaches to the inside of your humerus or your arm bone. Last but not least, if you can imagine looking straight through Jen and seeing the front side of her shoulder blade, you've got another big muscle there called your subscapularis. So the way I remember the rotator cuff muscles are the acronym SITS. Supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, subscapularis. Remember, we've covered 2 major muscle groups, the deltoids and the rotator cuff. Now that you have a better understanding of the actual muscles, let's take a look at the bones and joints involved in creating those movements around your shoulder. Let's dig in and look at the bones and the joints involved in creating movement around your shoulder. I'm going to have Jen just give us a quarter turn here. And the first thing that we're going to talk about is what's called your thoracic spine, or your middle back. There's 12 vertebrae here, and if you can imagine, they essentially start at the base of your neck come down and they end about the top of your lower back. So you've got 12 vertebrae here, and while you may not think they're important, those vertebrae attach to ribs, and then you have your scapula or your shoulder blade, which rests on top of that thoracic spine. So if you can imagine, you've got your scapula right here, and it just kind of rests on the top of your thoracic spine. Last but not least, you have your humerus or your arm bone. And if you can imagine, your humerus is this long upper arm bone. Now, when you're starting to create actual movements, your scapula and your humerus work together to create motion. And as you can imagine, there's a ton of freedom of movement. Your shoulder, like your hip, is a ball and socket joint. So they kind of move into each other like so. And then from that position, you've got tons of freedom of movement. You can flex your shoulder or raise it overhead. You can extend it, bringing it back down towards your side. You can abduct it or lift it away from your body. You can adduct it or add to your body by bringing it closer to the midline. And then last but not least, you have external rotation or opening your arm up, as well as internal rotation. So as you guys can imagine, there's a ton of freedom of movement at your shoulders. Mobility is absolutely critical, but now you guys should have a better understanding of how all those bones and joints work together to create more fluid movement. The next step is to show you guys all these movements with real functions so you can tie the muscles and the bones and joints together to see how it's going to look when you get into the gym. Now that you have a better idea of how your scapula or shoulder blade and your humerus, or that glenohumeral joint, work together to create motion, let's take a look at the individual muscles and the functions that they can do for you. When we're starting off here, we're going to start with your anterior deltoid. And as you recall, it starts on the outer portion of your clavicle, comes down, attaches to your humerus, so it spans that glenohumeral or shoulder joint. So when you're in the gym, you're probably used to doing or seeing people do a front raise. So that's where you're really going to bring out your anterior delt. It's not just your anterior delt though, it's also the clavicular portion of your pecs. So these two muscles are working together to create shoulder flexion. Now it only makes sense if you got your anterior delt and it creates shoulder flexion, your posterior delt or the back side of that muscle is going to do the opposite. It's going to create shoulder extension. Last but not least, you've got your middle delt, and it runs from the top of your scapula, comes down, and it attaches to your humerus. And if you've ever done a side lateral or something like that in the gym, that's where you're gonna see that middle delt being isolated. Now keep in mind, we've covered some isolated movements, but anytime you take your arms overhead, as you would in a seated military or any kind of overhead press, you're gonna be using all three of your deltoid heads synergistically to create that movement. Now that we've covered the deltoids, let's take a look at the individual functions of the rotator cuff. Now, one thing I want you guys to understand, a lot of times when we're talking about the rotator cuff, people want to talk about internal and external rotation. So when we're talking about the shoulder, you've got internal rotation and you have external rotation. Now, that's not to be confused with, if I bend Jen's elbow just a little bit here, you can actually pronate and supinate your hand as well without necessarily rotating your shoulder. So keep in mind, when you've got the arm straight and you're moving from the shoulder, that's where we're talking about internal and external rotation. So with that being said, you've got your subscapularis, and then that's that muscle that starts on the inside of your shoulder blade. It's responsible for internally rotating your shoulder or turning it inwards on a long axis. So if you've got your subscap internally rotating, you gotta have something on the back side that externally rotates. So I'm gonna have Jen spin around here. And if you can imagine on the back side, you've got your infraspinatus and you have your teres minor. So if she's internally rotated and I externally rotate her shoulder, that's where you're going to turn on and engage your infraspinatus and your teres minor. Now, last but not least, if we're talking about abduction of the shoulder, you remember you've got your supraspinatus and it kind of runs along the top of your scapula or your shoulder blade. It's there to abduct or lift your arm away from your side. And a lot of times, if you read the research, and I'm a geek, I read research, it'll tell you that supraspinatus is responsible for about the first 30 degrees of abduction. Now, we've gotten kind of geeky and we've talked about internal rotation, external rotation, abduction. That's all fine and dandy. But when we talk about your rotator cuff, arguably the truest role is to create stability throughout your shoulder joint. So if I just had Jen's arm hanging out here and I pull on her arm a little bit, her rotator cuff works almost like a tractor beam. It's pulling her shoulder back into the socket. So you guys think about when you do a dumbbell row or when you do a chin up and you get long through your arm, your rotator cuff is naturally turning on to create stability throughout your shoulder joint. So while you can do all kinds of isolated movements, if your shoulder and your rotator cuff are doing what they're supposed to, it's not going to take a lot of necessary isolated training to get the kind of result that you're looking for. Now that we've covered the muscles, the joints, and the function of your deltoids and your shoulders, let's put it all together into a few key exercises that we've selected to help you best understand how to apply this stuff when you're in the gym. Now keep in mind, this is simply for demonstration purposes. Jen's gonna make it look easy, and we couldn't get the 100-pound dumbbells in here for the overhead presses. But overhead pressing is a fantastic exercise. It's really gonna help you build all of those deltoid heads, so that's gonna be the first exercise that we demonstrate here today. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and have Jen pick up the dumbbells, and one of the things that's most important when you're overhead pressing is a good setup. A lot of times I'll cue my clients and athletes to go with their feet about hip-shoulder width apart, get their abs nice and tight, and their butt nice and tight. When they do this, they've got a really solid foundation, which is not only gonna help them move more weight, but it's also gonna help them keep their lower back healthy as well. So Jen's gonna go ahead and bring the dumbbells up to her shoulders, abs tight, butt tight, and then from this position, she's just gonna push straight up overhead. Now, it looks pretty simple, but the devil is really in the details. Keep the abs tight and the butt tight throughout, nice controlled motion throughout, and if for any reason you do have shoulder issues and overhead pressing gives you, some shoulder pain, what I would suggest doing is turning your thumbs or your palms towards you, going to a more neutral grip. This is just gonna give that rotator cuff a little bit more room to breathe, and it's gonna take some stress off the shoulders as well. When you're overhead pressing, don't forget you're literally using all three heads of your deltoids to create the movement. The posterior delt, the middle delt, and finally the anterior deltoid. Now, you'll probably see lots of people banging away with tons of isolation exercises at the gym. Trust me, I get it, I love those exercises too. But if you want to maximize the growth and development of your deltoids, you got to make sure you're throwing a big compound overhead press in your lift. Last but not least, when people go overhead, some people have a tendency to have pain, dysfunction, or they just don't move particularly well into that range of motion. If that's the case, make sure you're getting that checked out, make sure your mobility and your overhead range of motion is there before you go full steam ahead with your overhead pressing. So the first exercise we demonstrated was an overhead press, and that should be a staple. But the second exercise and final exercise that we're going to demonstrate here today is a bent over lateral raise. And I really like this because it helps isolate the posterior deltoid, or the back of the shoulder. So Jen's going to go ahead and set up with these dumbbells here. And what I like to cue my clients to do is soft knees and hips back, like you would in a Romanian deadlift or straight leg deadlift. And from this position, she's simply going to lift the arms up and out to the side, and that's where you're going to hit that posterior deltoid, right? And you can see she's got great control here. Too often, when people do this exercise, they use way too much weight, and it's just all momentum. So she's doing a great job of holding that top, holding that peak contraction, and then relaxing as she goes back down. So these muscles are typically pretty weak. Don't worry about going super heavy when you're in the gym. Go lighter, do it right, and you're gonna get way more out of the exercise. Now keep in mind, we've only highlighted 2 shoulder exercises in this episode. If you want to see all the exercises we've selected, make sure to download the full 6-week Built by Science program. In this video, we've covered the muscles, the joints, the function, and some key exercises for your shoulders. But if I can give you guys one takeaway point, it's awesome to have a great looking set of shoulders that would be really strong through your shoulder joints. But the bad news is, if you injure these guys, you're in big trouble. Not only can you not train shoulders, you can't train chest, you can't train back, and even think about legs. A lot of times when you're back squatting, you're putting pressure on that shoulder joint. So it's not just important to build these for the aesthetic or strength purposes, but you gotta keep them healthy as well. So when it comes to your shoulders, make sure you're taking the time and energy to warm up thoroughly before you go through the workouts so you keep yourself healthy and you can keep pushing the iron for as long as you want. With that being said, that's a wrap on this video. Make sure you watch all of the videos because we go into the same amount of depth and detail to show you how all the different muscles in your body work.
Learn muscular anatomy, biomechanics, the skeletal system, muscle function, and the best exercises to build lean mass. Knowledge is power. Know yourself to build yourself. Build yourself with the best. Mind, muscle, masterpiece.